Okay, so I thought this was a really interesting chapter when Bergson starts going after Kant, which I thought was pretty interesting, and talking about philosophy and its relation to science, and then the geometry stuff at the end. One thing again, maybe he's going to say more about this later. This is a constant problem, that maybe he'll clarify this later. Or maybe I just don't get it. But when he's talking about these two modes of going to the extremes of the way we can experience things, I've forgotten how he puts it. I'm on the top of page 200. It's in this section he calls intellect and materiality. But like you can go to the extreme of using your intellect, and you can have this mode of awareness that's just like pure spatiality. I kind of have a sense of what that feels like, or what that's like, what it's like to experience that kind of thing. But at the other extreme, at the top of 200, where we're kind of embedded in pure duration, granted, I can't, to say I don't understand it is not even the right way to put it, because this is something you're supposed to have, just sort of pure experience. And it's not something you could understand. But here at the top of 200, he says, we must, by a strong recoil of our personality on itself, gather up our past, which is slipping away, in order to thrust it compact and undivided into a present, which it will create by entering. Rare indeed are the moments when we are self-possessed to this extent. It is then that our actions are truly free. And even at these moments, we do not completely possess ourselves. Our feeling of duration, I should say, the actual coinciding of ourselves with itself, admits of degrees. But the more the feeling is deep and the coincidence complete, the more the life in which it replaces us absorbs intellectuality by transcending it. And I don't know that I've ever had any kind of experience even approximating that. And maybe I have, and I just haven't recognized it. But, when he talks about at the other extreme, this feeling of sort of pure spatiality, when you let go of your personality, and you just kind of observe things happening, that I think I've had some experience of, but this I don't. So if that's what I have to do, here he's talking, it seems to me, about this sort of method of philosophy where you try to get in touch with this pure duration from which things emerge, rather than the other extreme of using your intellect to cut up and divide everything. It's kind of like, when Husserl says you have to, I forgot what he calls it, but he has this, this method of phenomenology that you have to access. And I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know how to do that. And so that's kind of where I'm wondering, if he was just talking about a kind of experience that I didn't have access to, I might be kind of sad. But if this is going to be the kind of core of his philosophical method, it seems like it ought to be something that people who are interested in it could find their way to. And he does seem to think it's universally available. I just don't seem to have any connection there.
Yeah, so what it really reminded me of is meditation. And so I think you could make the comparison with Husserl and his, phenomenological reduction or whatever, but it really reminded me of meditation in that, so there's typically, you can kind of classify meditations into two distinct types, or we'll go with this kind of methodological dichotomy in the spirit of Bergson, I guess. So there's one way of thinking of it as where you just simply try to concentrate on one thing and continuously go back to that, and you basically work on your attention, your concentration, like it's a muscle. So whenever you lose focus, you just simply go back to that. So that would be called, I forget what that one's called. It's just like object-oriented or something like that.
a Buddhist teacher I heard called that absorption
Oh
meditation.
yes, that sounds right. Yeah. So there's like the absorption method, I guess, and similar to that, but a little different in that it's a kind of expansion of that is an open monitoring, or and I think they call that in Buddhism vipassana. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it's something like that where you try to constantly stay attuned to just all of your experience kind of simultaneously. You just try to stay like totally inside like this present moment as it's flowing. And that's kind of what I see there when he's talking about this kind of like effort of concentration. And so he's talking a lot about this kind of this tension, this concentration in which memory kind of contains itself from moment to moment as much as possible. So that definitely, although I've never really thought of meditation in terms of attaining memory or even in these terms at all, really, but it makes sense that it's something kind of like that. So I think that's if anything, at least a good analogy that if you can kind of get into a state of mind where you're kind of like the chattering mind of your intellect somewhat falls away, never completely, which is kind of why I understand what he's saying, that our feeling of duration, I should say the actual coinciding of ourself with itself, admits of degrees. I definitely think that's accurate, and that's also kind of part of what duration is a kind of way of something to differentiate within itself, because there's no just one self that's abiding through everything as the same thing. Kind of what it is as duration is its own kind of modulation or fluctuation, and that's really what the essence of something is. I think for Bergson is its kind of rhythm of duration, but this method is a kind of attuning to things, like he's talking about this concentration. So he doesn't necessarily talk about it so much in this one, except he talks about it as an effort. And I was reading Deleuze's Bergsonism, and it has a really good explanation of this. And so he brings in Bergson's other books, of course. And one thing that helped me understand it is he talks about it as kind of using your own duration, and then in a kind of effort of the imagination to kind of coincide with other durations, so that you put yourself inside of another object or duration by this kind of leap of imagination, where you try to actually have a kind of sympathy with these things. And you actually see where this kind of leads to ultimately in ethical philosophy about sympathy and empathy and whatnot. So that definitely helped me, thinking of it in terms of like a conscious effort to use the imagination to try to kind of coincide with other things, as well as this kind of attuning to things yourself in your own kind of present moment, in this effort of concentration versus a kind of distracted state where you would kind of just whatever. You become kind of like just pure materiality. Well, there's no pure materiality, I guess, but more material, more spatial would be a kind of distracted state where you're almost absent-minded. So that at least helped me to kind of understand, I think, what he's going after.
So I could be wrong about this, but I actually associated that other extreme of spatiality with mindfulness meditation. You know, the I forgot what you called it, but the one that's the opposite of absorptive.
Yeah. Open monitoring, mindfulness. Yeah.
Because, you know, in that state, you just maintain this open awareness of everything, and you can lose track of self. You can kind of lose track of there being any self there, and there's just a pure as you say, monitoring or awareness. And even I've heard some of the Zen teachers at the Zen Center call this pure spaciousness, this spaciousness of mind and that sort of thing. And so I associated, and again, maybe I'm wrong, but rather than, unless you were calling that a distracted state, I associated it not with just being kind of distracted, but just having that open, sort of almost ungrounded awareness of things as that extreme. That's why I say I can kind of get a sense of what that might be like, but I haven't really. Maybe I did a little bit when I was interested in Christian mysticism, but I haven't really practiced absorptive, whatever that is, meditation, and so I don't have much of a sense of that. I guess maybe that's something I should experiment with.
Yeah, so that seems definitely kind of complicated. I think one way to see it is, so with meditation, there's a kind of releasement from this kind of empirical, practical world of distinct objects, and the idea of especially like this kind of time binding idea where you attune to things of what am I going to do? Because that's mostly what our thoughts are kind of about. They're about the future and planning things, and like Bergson says, that this kind of action oriented thing, that we perceive things as like cut up according to ways that we can manipulate things or act upon things in the future, more so than just as they are right now. So I think the kind of say falling out of the self, especially in a, let's say, the lowercase self, the kind of empirical identity self, I see that also as this kind of release that have to do with the future and action, these things, which I think he says is essentially more tuned to materiality. So I think the way that you have a kind of expansive feeling that kind of supersedes, the limited, like closed-end idea, the distinctness, discontinuous self. I think that kind of goes along with what he's saying, and also with this method of intuition, because it's a kind of expansive thing. And that's why he talks about this stuff is like, ultimately these things are a part of an open system, an open whole. And that's how you really come to terms with this duration. There is no necessarily completely separate durations. They're kind of like different articulations within one duration. Ultimately, there's, in a way, there's like relatively closed systems, but there's never any kind of absolutely closed system. It's all part of this one, whole duration, the open whole. And I think that kind of expansiveness and almost like transcendence of the self, which he also seems to talk about, that could kind of correspond with that, that Zen feeling of awakening to a kind of transcendence of the limited empirical identity in some sense. So maybe that's another way to kind of see it. I'm not sure exactly if Bergson would agree, but yeah.
If you're right about that, one reason that made me want to associate it with that mindfulness experience was because of that, as you say, that notion of being releasing, that he associates with the extreme intellectuality, and that sort of meditation does feel like a kind of releasing. On the other hand, it also requires a certain kind of focus at the same time. And so if what you're saying is right, I'm wondering if maybe the intellectual extreme would be, and I'm just speculating here, I'm just trying to figure out what he means. Maybe it would be more something like when you're completely wrapped up in your habits and you're doing something in the world, like you're actively doing things, because he keeps, I mean, that's another factor in your favor of your interpretation, is he associates the intellect and materiality with action. And so maybe that, as you say, that what you're calling distracted is maybe more when you're wrapped up in your habitual way of doing things, and you're just engaged in doing stuff, and you're not really attending to what you're doing. You're not really, but you see the world in a certain kind of, I'm trying to, Ed's not here, but it's kind of like it reminds me of the Heidegger, whichever one it is, where you're engaged with things and you're just picking up the hammer and hammering stuff, and you're doing this and you're doing that, and the hammer is there, and it's auto, and you don't even have to think about it being there. You just know it's there, because I remember he talks about one mode of intellectuality where you don't actually have to reflectively it's not necessarily reflective intellectuality, or that's one way of experiencing it. There's sort of an unreflected intellectuality where the world just appears to you, I gather, as a world of things that are there for doing things and for jobs. And so maybe that's the other extreme, rather than the mindfulness. Maybe it's that unthinking, habitual, I'm just doing stuff kind of way, without really, but again, I'm just kind of speculating.
Yeah, so the Heidegger's thing is there's the ready to hand, where you're just kind of thinking in terms of activities and intentions and whatnot, and that's where you're using the hammer, but you're just thinking, you're not thinking of the hammer itself as this distinct object. You're thinking in terms of its uses, and you don't really notice it until it breaks, and then that's when you're like, oh shit, a hammer, look at that, it's broken. And then that's the present at hand. But then the problem would be, so he associates the ready to hand with a kind of like absorption in a way that sounds a lot like the way that Bergson also kind of talks about this sort of intentionality and action and whatnot. So I don't see the connection in that sense, except Heidegger, he says that the present at hand is that kind of like calculative, Cartesian way of analysis of like, this is an object in space, and you can measure it and all these things like that. So then that would kind of, so it seems like, I think Bergson would say those are both kind of, different methods of working with so there's one is kind of perception, and then the other one is kind of that intellectual analysis that he talks about. So I think Heidegger would also agree with that. And then I think Bergson's intuition, though, would be something that would be neither of those. It would be something like, I don't know, probably something that the later Heidegger would talk about is, his quasi-mystical kind of stuff about, releasement and things like that, where you become just like receptive to being and all that. I think maybe there'd be something like that would correspond more with Bergson, but then obviously their systems aren't completely kind of transposable onto each other, but just for the sake of comparison, yeah.
No, I'm agreeing with you. So, because what I was thinking was, this is at the bottom of 211. He said, the very last sentence, he says, we may notice as a fact that the questions of situation and magnitude are the first that present themselves to our activity. those which intelligence externalized in action resolves even before reflective intelligence has appeared. And so I was not associating that ready to hand with the duration. I was associating, like you were, both of those modes with the intelligence. But one is when you're, when you're a philosopher and you're conceptualizing the hell out of everything, or when you're, doing some sort of taxonomy, self-reflective thing. The other one is when you're engaged in that ready-to-hand kind of way, but the world still appears to you as a bunch of objects that are clearly defined and separated from one another and has a function. Even if I'm not reflecting it on as a hammer, as he says here, there's this intelligence externalized in action that's not reflective. So I was making the same comparison, that both of those modes would be, so that what I was saying is maybe that when you were talking about this sort of distracted way, rather than being attending to your experience, the distracted way, that sort of ready to hand habitual mode of acting in the world is still a manifestation of the intellect, rather than that whatever the other one is.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, because that also goes along with his so he makes this point, which is just as important as the other distinctions, is that he's saying that perception and the kind of intellectual mathematical movement, I guess, that tends towards pure spatiality and geometry and all this, that they're cut out of the same cloth in a sense, that they have the same genesis, I guess. So that's a good observation, because that goes into kind of this other major distinction that he's trying to make.
So I'm a little bit confused, just because, so on page 192, this is the Method of Philosophy section near the end of it. On page 192, it's the second full paragraph. So in this section, he says a few different things, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of sentences. This one's starting second from the bottom. It is the essence of reasoning to shut us up in the circle of the given, but action breaks the circle. And then near the bottom of the section, but if the risk be frankly accepted, action will perhaps cut the knot that reasoning has tied and will not unloose. And my understanding of this general section is he seems to be making the point that action is the opposite of intelligence, and this kind of intellectual reining in, this kind of intellectual incapacity to conceive of things external to the self. Action is something that actually carries us towards duration, in the sense of it allows us to obtain new possibilities, engage with new realities, kind of extend beyond the circle that reasoning draws around us. So I also see what y'all are saying in terms of on page 211, what Nevid was quoting, and some of this other stuff. He certainly seems to be talking about certain kinds of actions that are also just expressions of intelligence, but he seems to be making the point, at least in 182, that action is in some way associated with being able to break out of intelligence. And I'm a little bit, I don't know, I guess I'm asking for clarification, or because now that you guys have presented this to me, it almost kind of sounds like a contradiction, but
yeah. So I think so he says later in this chapter that action is that things can only really move in the real, so that action is definitely engaged with the absolute. I think he says, in a sense, it's not the totality of the real or whatnot, but so he doesn't want to say that there's some kind of a allusion to these things, or okay. So I think the real kind of problem is, so this is kind of his method, is that he first starts by trying to, that there's a mixture of things where the problem is there's like this problematic mixture where one thing is, the whole is seen in terms of just one thing. So his big thing is basically that if we think of all these things in terms of spatiality and the intellect and whatnot, and then that's seen as the whole that is projected onto everything, that's what he's trying to question. So he basically is trying to make distinctions within that whole in order to really determine what are the actual natural articulations within this multiplicity that is a real composite, but not in the sense of just one term projected onto the whole of everything else. So he's trying to make this qualitative distinction, I think, between our perception and the way that the intellect kind of cuts things up and sees things in terms of this pure spatiality. And then there's also, the qualitative durational aspect, which I think he would definitely say that that is what is engaged in action. And that's what, can break through certain things. I'm not sure what is I can't remember exactly the habits of the mind, I guess, that he says they can break through. I'm not sure exactly, but so I think what's going on there is he's making that distinction, and so that our action in some way is definitely engaged in this durational thing. And then you also have, though, these perceptual articulations that are very similar to the way that the intellect works in, mathematical, geometrical sense. But then he wants to ultimately say, and he does this for all of his, dualities, that really these are part of one thing, that these are natural articulations within what is really a multiplicity, but it's not a quantitative multiplicity, which is the way that the intellect will naturally see it. It's a qualitative multiplicity like duration. So it actually gets even more complicated than that, because ultimately he's going to say that, spatiality is a part of something, a whole also that includes duration with it. That's a natural kind of tendency or movement within. I think, does he say? Maybe I'm going to confuse. I think he wants to say that ultimately the whole is duration, I guess, but then he also says something about. I think it may be that I'm confusing him, because I think the distinction I'm thinking of here is when he talks about maybe like the spatial intellect and the durational intuition, that ultimately they're all part of a consciousness in general, I think he says. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but well, hopefully that kind of helps somewhat.
So I'm going to go back to the previous page, page 191, to the page before where Sean was reading, and about halfway through the large paragraph at the end, he says, to act and to know that we are acting, to come into touch with reality and even to live it, but only in the measure in which it concerns the work that is being accomplished and the furrow that is being plowed. Such is the function of the human intelligence. Yet a beneficent fluid bathes us when we draw the very force to labor and to live. From this ocean of life in which we are immersed, we are continually drawing something, and we feel that our being, or at least the intellect that guides it, has been formed therein by a kind of local concentration. Philosophy can only be an effort to dissolve again into the whole. Intelligence, reabsorbed into its principle, may thus live back again its own genesis. And then on the next page, the first full paragraph, he says, well, someone might say that this is, you're using the intellect to try to transcend the intellect, which sounds circular, But then that paragraph that Sean read from the first sentence, this objection presents itself naturally to the mind. And so what I think he's doing in that swimming example is trying to show, I mean, it's related to what Sean was saying, that the intellect and intuition, I guess, are not radically distinct. Sorry to keep jumping around, on the top of 193, a couple of sentences down, he says, all around conceptual thought, there remains an indistinct fringe which recalls its origin. And further, we compared the intellect to a solid nucleus formed by means of condensation. This nucleus does not differ radically from the fluid surrounding it. It can only be reabsorbed in it because it is made of the same substance. And so I think what he's doing with that swimming example is he's showing how our normal mode of life is this intellectual mode, but that in something that is sort of automatic, like swimming, it is embedded in intellectuality in the senses that we were talking about before, where the intellectual mind is dividing the world up into things so that it can accomplish purposes and actions. But because that intellectuality is of the same, I don't know what to call it, I don't want to say the same kind, but it is this condensed nucleus. That sort of engaged activity has the potential to help us move into this other way of experiencing that is less intellectual and more intuitive. And so I think this is, part his method is going to have something to do with that, with somehow moving from this mode of intellectuality that we normally engage in, and from within that very same mode, somehow sort of transitioning into a different way of experiencing things that is, as Sean said, is more holistic and undivided and integrated. So I think the swimming is supposed to be an example of that kind of transition.
Yeah, that helps a lot. First of all, I just want to say those are some beautiful passages of writing. Just the beneficent fluid bathes us, the ocean of life, and all. Oh, that's just, yeah, Nobel Prize in literature right there. But so I think though this definitely helps. So it's kind of the problem, I think, is when it's hard for us to think that whether it's like the intellect that in some ways kind of reduces the real in some way, but then it's still a part of it. We have a hard time, I think, just through our intellects, I guess, trying to really grok that. And I think this also goes into what his whole thing about science that he talks about, where he's saying, he's kind of, in one sense, he's critiquing it and saying, we can't think of everything in terms of the way that science talks about it as, these quantitative magnitudes in space where everything is external to everything else, and his whole thing. But then he doesn't want to say that it's totally relative or it's like an illusion either. He wants to say that it's, I believe, approximate is that they're like within science, that there's relative levels of approximation to the real, but ultimately science is grasping something real and even absolute. And I think that goes along with what he's also talking about in terms of the way that kind of action and perception have this kind of interplay between a kind of approximation or a kind of reduction or something like that, where it is using the intellect and whatnot to kind of carve out and highlight certain dimensions over others. But ultimately it's in this like vast, wider, open whole of kind of meta duration, I guess. And I see something similar also with basically what is his whole idea about science also, that in some way it's connecting with the real, but it's just not all of the real. I think that's kind of what he really wants us to see, the connection there between the way that we like intellectually talk about, say, the way that science, the knowledge that science has, and also the way that our perception works and the way that the intellect naturally works and mathematics and all these things, that ultimately they're cut out of this greater whole in some sense. So, yeah.
Sean, you were going to say something a minute ago? Yeah.
I don't remember what it was, but I'm actually, it might have been this because I've kind of had this on my brain for a while. So in the mystical element of Heidegger's thought, the author of which I've forgotten at the moment, there's a section. So it's mostly about kind of comparing Heidegger with Meister Eckhart. But there's a section where it talks about um, Heidegger's relationship with some of the more mystical elements of like sort of Buddhism and especially Zen Buddhism. And there's this kind of extended discussion of oh God, I'm forgetting all of the names associated with this, but there was apparently this German guy who went to China and studied with like a Chin Buddhist sect that specifically focused on archery. And the entire thing that he was supposed to do was effectively to learn how to fire a bow effectively without thinking about it. So it's all focused on like this perfect capacity to like kind of knock the arrow, draw the string, shoot the arrow, hit the target, without kind of like any amount of intellectualization of that process. And I don't know if that is a good example to flow with in terms of what y'all are sort of discussing here. I guess like I'm just trying to figure out how to integrate action into the discussion, because like, a lot of what we were talking about in terms of the practical example of this experience earlier surrounded meditation. And since I had it in my head from that section that I read earlier and that we kind of went over, that action was supposed to be an important part of sort of escaping a purely intellectualized impression of the world, I was sort of like, well, I guess I just don't get how meditation would be a good example of that. I've been basically doing what we've been calling absorption meditation for about a month now, and this is the first time I've ever like tried to seriously meditate. And I don't want to say it's precisely intellectual in the way that Bergson is talking about, but it definitely feels much more intellectual than what you would find acceptable. Like it feels like it's a very intellectualizing process. I mean, I say that I've been doing it for a month now, and I feel like I'm doing really bad at meditating. So I might not be the best authority on this, but so yeah, I was basically just trying to come up with what a good example would be, and that's the only thing that comes to my mind is trying to. Well, I say that I have one other example that I would be curious to hear people mull over. So I have a friend of mine. His name is Josh. I think you've probably talked about him before, but one thing that he'll do occasionally that I think is just like absolutely hilarious is he will basically just be like, I need to chop down a tree. And he will get an axe and he will go off into the woods and he will chop down a tree. And it seems to be just a process that he occasionally has to go through because he is partly just because he's like so pent up with energy. He's like a very like energetic, kinesthetic person. And so he just needs shit to do sometimes. But the way that he describes it almost sounds like meditative in the sense that he kind of just goes there and he doesn't really think about what his like he doesn't think about the other problems of his life or like anything else. He just like is there and he's chopping down a tree and he's kind of dealing with all of the problems that arise in the process of chopping down a tree. So I guess I mean these seems I think they're criticizable to me. They kind of click with what some of what y'all have been saying and what I understand Bergson to mean, but certainly in other ways it would seem like you could critique the for instance, Josh chopping down the tree is an attempt to do this because, and I mean, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like an instrumentalization and materialization of something. So I'd be curious to hear thoughts about it.
So you guys have probably heard of
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Maybe I'll go ahead since Chase is frozen. You guys have probably heard, Chase, I started because you froze for a minute. Maybe you've heard of this notion of flow. There was a guy, I'm going to put his name in the chat because I can't pronounce it, who wrote a book, the book called Flow years ago. He was I think a psychologist or something at the University of Chicago. But it's the science of optimal experience. But the idea seemed to be that it's that mode of experience where a person is completely absorbed in their activity and they kind of lose self. And so, I mean, I think it happens to a lot of people. So for example, we talked about this before, because I remember Chase talking about playing soccer, but when you're thoroughly engaged in an activity that actually requires a great deal of skill, but you've mastered those skills and you can deploy them. I actually use this when I'm trying to describe the Greek concept of eudaimonia, when you're just thoroughly, you're just doing what you're doing and you're really good at it, and you just have this lovely feeling. You're a musician and you're playing the piano piece and it's just working, or you're dancing. And so, I'm wondering if it's something like that, like the swimming example. And, I think of those kinds of examples, they can almost be like, like with regard to meditation, at least in the Zen tradition, which is more mindfulness rather than the absorption kind. It's more the open-minded one there are, by the way, Buddhist types of meditations that are absorption meditation as well. But in the open-mindedness one, when you're sitting on the cushion, there's this kind of experience, but then there are also these activities. I mean, the simple one is they call it kinhin, which is a slow walk, where you try to integrate movement with this same state of mind. And I think of Tai Chi as a potential for that. And I think some of these flow activities can be that as well. And so those kinds of activities, you're in this sort of open, I don't know if you've heard of like the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, actionless action, when you're sort of acting without intention and you're just doing what you're doing, but you're not having to reflect on it a great deal. But I'm wondering if maybe it's something like that, where the intellect is still engaged because you're actually acting, you're doing something. And so the intellect is engaged, but on the other hand, because you're absorbed in this activity and in this almost meditative sort of way, it provides an environment for this sort of transition from the experience of intellectuality into the experience of duration. And so I think it's like some of these kinds of experiences are sort of a meeting point between intellectuality and intuition. And so it's kind of like a convergence of universes or something. And so it provides a transition point where we might be able to slip and slide from one into the other.
yeah, I think the whole idea of the kind of flow state is really helpful for seeing that. I think part of the problem is that all these things are basically composites, and we're using our intellect right now in the sense that we're trying to somewhat like erase those differences that make it a composite, and think of it in terms of like presenting just like one overall concept rather than what it really is, which is a kind of mix. And in that sense, we can basically cut it up along all these conceptual lines. But I think really the key, I think that what helped kind of get to this sense of how action is a kind of is a composite in a way that's confusing is that action in a way is kind of guided by the intellect to a certain degree, and but then on another degree it's still acting within this, you know, continuous undivided reality of duration and whatnot. And I think, you know, the whole idea of the flow state and, you know, different kinds of meditation that emphasize movement. So Nevid already talked about some, but you have something like Tai Chi or something like that, or even there's a like walking meditation where you're engaged with all these things, you're moving around, but the idea is to kind of somewhat diminish the intellectual kind of reflection that kind of maps out, in a sense, what you're doing. So you're still doing it, you're still very much present and engaged in what you're doing, but you're not doing it in a way that's kind of like hyper reflective. So I think in a way it's kind of that the problem is that intelligence, the intellect, it has kind of like multiple tiers to it, or all these multiple elements, and you know, some of them are more similar to what Bergson is talking about than others. But I think what's really to really get it is I think we need to look at where he's talking about how they kind of match up, how ultimately the intellect that kind of cuts things through these articulations, that it's still engaged with something real. And it's also this perception, that aspect of it is the same thing as the movement towards matter and spatiality itself. And that's what's, I think, really interesting about this section is the way that he talks about that, in that he's saying that, you know, the intellect as a kind of tendency is in one sense distinct from, but also kind of, I think he talks about it as like cut along the same lines of articulation as the movement towards matter itself. And I think understanding that, I think would help a lot in terms of trying to understand exactly what's going on with the aspect that perception engages with that has to do with the intellect, but then also the aspect of action that engages with something that kind of transcends just the mere intellect, in the same way that the intellect also cuts out of something that is very real and part of a greater whole. And it's not something that's, you know, illusory or totally relative, but it's something that's very much engaged with the reality of, you know, movement and duration and whatnot.
I don't think that I really have a clear conception of a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, like I think the later portion of this section. But I'll just say this, that my conception of this passage, without the understanding of what continues on forward, I just reading it now, I don't see action as the thing that will allow us to kind of go past intelligence or break away from it. I saw this kind of section as more of just an example of what it means to break away from something that feels like a circle. And so, like, in the context of this, for example, like walking would be like intelligence, and swimming would be like this thing that is beyond intelligence that we don't necessarily can fully understand, because it's not something that we interact with constantly in our lives. And so in this context, action is the thing that allows us to kind of break from walking, because we're able to go into this new environment and see swimming by the action of doing it, of putting ourselves in that different experience. And to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that action is what we need to do to break from intelligence, but that we need some sort of new environment. We need to put intelligence into something that it has never been in before, and use it in a way to kind of break from this imaginary circle that we've created in intelligence. But that kind of brings forth a lot of questions from me, like, what if we put it in this new environment and then find a circle in that new environment? You know, it's like, how many new environments do we have to find and create to continue evolving and extending the ability of intelligence? And then I also think, you know, he's trying to get into it this next section, but I don't really understand kind of how we're supposed to thrust intelligence outside itself, and what is this act of will that is doing that, you know? But I think it has to do with spatiality, and I think it has to do with some sort of kind of like more action-based intelligence, but I don't think it's necessarily action. I think it's like a certain conception of spatiality in relation to intelligence, which could, I guess, be considered some level of action. But I don't think he literally means like we need to physically do things necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a few different reasons that I guess led me to the suspicion that action would be a critical part of this. But I mean, I think you might be right that it's just it's not a key. It might not necessarily be necessary. I think part of what was leading me to that idea was you know, this dichotomy that he set up between uh, intelligence and instinct, because I guess the way that I conceive of instinct is in the same way that we observe it, right? And we see things like insects just doing things, and they're doing things on objects and entities that they encounter, and like reacting to them in ways, but they don't seem to be, at least as far as we can tell, like intellectualizing it, or you know, having like, I don't know, instinctive contemplation or something like that. You know, I also think that uh, so that might have been leading me in that direction, and the other thing that might have been leading me in that direction is just um, the need to like have a process that is going to integrate new stuff. And it seems to me like any kind of introspective process is necessarily not going to engage us with new ideas. It's going to result in us kind of doing what you were describing, which is just kind of like inscribing a new circle, like unfolding a new sort of set of possibilities. And I was thinking of this with respect to a thing that Chase was saying earlier. You know, I think that there might be a difference of like, instead of like a difference of like kind, a difference of like flow or unfolding between, okay, so you have our intelligence laying out a set of actions for us. So we're like planning a set of actions, and then we perform those actions according to the way we imagine them, right? Or we conceive of them beforehand. And I'm thinking of like, you know, every time that you've like, I don't know, tried to plan for a situation, like an interview or something like that, by trying to sit down and like think about like every single possible question you could receive and every single answer that you could sort of like, you're kind of taking this one intellectual thought and then trying to unfold it into a bunch of different actions that you're then going to like try and aggressively take in response to something. And I think that's like a very intellectualized mode of doing action, because action is flowing from your intelligence. I think the alternative like flow, or the like an alternative possibility would to sort of be in a situation where you receive something, so you find something out, you discover something. And I'm kind of thinking about this, I guess, a little bit like Heidegger's whole conception of the moment when your hammer breaks and you have the realization that it, oh, well, this is a thing that consists of parts, and like you're forced out of a kind of like common intellectualized way of conceiving of things. But so maybe I think I was operating under the assumption that action was an important part just because it seems like that's the main way that you arrive at new pieces of information. Now, maybe action is a bad way to approach that, just because I guess you could have, again, kind of like what we've been talking about with meditation, like just a moment to moment awareness of new facts, new possibilities, that you aren't trying to intellectualize, and therefore you aren't trying to shove into like the kind of whole classical Piaget thing of assimilation, right? You aren't just trying to shove new pieces of information that you're seeing in the world into um, things that you already know, facts that you already understand, and stuff like that. But I guess I just had like a little bit of a bias in thinking of that as like active and kind of activity. But maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe you can kind of sit there and just be aware of things.
So I want to go all the way back to page 135 and 136, where he first brings up the difference between intelligence and instinct, and there he's really focusing on their common origin. The last paragraph: it is because intelligence and instinct, having originally been interpenetrating, retain some of their common origin. Neither is ever found in a pure state. And then on the next page, 136, at the very bottom, the last few sentences: now the life manifested by an organism is, in our view, a certain effort to obtain certain things from the material world. No wonder, therefore, if it is the diversity of this effort that strikes us in instinct and intelligence, and if we see in these two modes of psychic activity, above all else, two different methods of action on inert matter. And so it seems, the sense I get, and this is creative evolution. I think he's thinking about the way instinct and intellect evolved was for the purpose of doing things in the world. And that's one of the reasons why he, says we're different from the vegetative, because they have instincts too, but they don't motivate the organism to move about as much. And so I think he seems to think that both of these features of whatever he calls it, psychic life or something, are aimed at adapting an organism to a material world where it has to move in order to survive. It has to find food and consume food. And that instinct and intellect both are therefore modes of adapting that organism to action. And so I think that's why he focuses on action so much. And then instinct and intellect are two different ways of doing that. The one is where the instinct is where there isn't this breaking the world down into little chunks as much anyway, and it just, a creature instinctively picks up something and does something with it. And then you've got this other intellectual mode for carving the world up. But they're both modes of, are ways that the organism acts in the world. And so then I think Sean's probably right that in these meditative modes of meditation, you can kind of, or at least you can maybe get close to distilling the psychic activity apart from physical activity. So there may be a way, through meditative processes to kind of distill those down and make them minimally associated with action. But since they seem to be, their primary function seems to be to make the organism engage actively in the world, that's why I think maybe some of these kinds of activities we've been talking about are places where you can find that transition, because since these two modes are not radically distinct, you can find them intermixed in certain kinds of activities. And that affords us the possibility of getting something like an intuition of this whole. And one of the, again, I'm using these Zen and Taoist examples. I mean, I hope they're appropriate, but in Zen, they say when you cut carrots, cut carrots. And part of what they're saying there is allow yourself to be completely absorbed in this experience. And then an example I've mentioned before is a Taoist uses like cutting a carcass along the joints. And so if you can imagine yourself in a mode of activity, today's sensibilities, maybe this is a bit gross, but if you're cutting up a chicken, or cutting up some animal, you could cut through the bones, but that would be more effort. But if you allow the body to communicate to you where its natural articulations are, then you can kind of slide through these joint regions, and, to use Bergson's ideas, the chicken is a whole chicken. It's not a bunch of parts stuck together. It's not, legs and wings and breasts stuck together. It's a whole chicken. And nevertheless, there are natural articulations in that body. And so I think, if you were in this sort of, I guess, meditative mode where you weren't overly analyzing, like my wife's a veterinarian, and when she sees a chicken, she starts naming the bones and stuff, this is that bone and this is that bone and these are how these things fit together. But rather than doing that, just allowing yourself to be completely absorbed in the experience, and the intellect is active there because you are seeing a chicken that has legs and wings and so on. On the other hand, if you're thoroughly absorbed in the activity, maybe it gives you an opportunity to experience this interaction between you and this other body, so you can just naturally find, so rather than having to look at a picture on the wall of the anatomy of a chicken and try to figure out where you should cut, which would be the hyper intellectualized thing, maybe or like if you were going to program a robot to cut a chicken up, you would have to program that information. But because you are a living being that is addressing this other object, you can sort of find, without having to over-intellectualize, find the natural articulations in this body and slide through them. And they're not absolute. Again, they're not a bunch of parts glued together into a body. Neither is it a perfectly homogeneous whole that has no articulations. It is a continuous body where all the parts are interconnected with all the parts, but it does have these natural articulations. And so I'm thinking, those sorts of activities where both the intellect and, I don't know if it would be, I guess maybe instead of instinct, maybe it would be intuition, but where the intellect and the intuition can both operate simultaneously, maybe can be, again, a place where we can begin to feel how this mode of experience is different and perhaps provide a different kind of philosophy.
Yeah, so to kind of go along with that, on page 156, kind of like, I don't know, about a third of the way down or so. So he says, Plato compares the good dialectician to the skillful cook who carves the animal without breaking its bones, by following the articulations marked out by nature. An intelligence which always proceeded thus would really be an intelligence turned towards speculation, which in another part of his book, he says by speculation he means to see, to really see, and he compares that with intuition. So, but action, and in particular fabrication, requires the opposite mental tendency. It makes us consider every actual form of things, even the form of natural things, as artificial and provisional. It makes our thought efface from the object perceived, even though organized and living, the lines that outwardly mark its inward structure. In short, it makes us regard its matter as indifferent to its form. So I see there, he's talking about action as something that cuts things up, that so perception and intelligence, when it's geared towards a particular type of action that sees things externally, that's where it gets this kind of provisional mode of where it sees things as spatial and that they can be cut up in any way possible in any variety. But then I think the part of action that he wants to kind of include ultimately with intuition, which is a kind of, you made a higher synthesis, but let's go with that term, higher synthesis of both intelligence and instinct. That's the internal kind of mode of action that he's talking about, that I think he wants to kind of contain. Although I agree that thinking of this in terms purely of action is basically wrong. But I guess here I'm just trying to kind of really figure out what are the natural articulations of action that he's actually talking about. So on 201, the I guess that second paragraph really down there. So he talks about basically this whole kind of method and whatnot. So here I see that he's talking about the kind of internal mode that can work with action, where he wants to kind of differentiate that from the kind of external projection of this kind of phase space grid that action and the intellect gives. So the more we succeed in making ourselves conscious of our progress in pure duration, the more we feel the different parts of our being enter into each other, and our whole personality concentrates itself in a point, or rather a sharp edge, pressed against the future and cutting into it unceasingly. It is in this that life and action are free. So I see there that he wants to put action into degrees, that there's basically a kind of spectrum of action, so that ultimately it's not action as a whole, as a qualitative distinction that is like the real key point here. And so action is one of those things that has quantitative differences of degree within it, because he talks about this feeling of duration as kind of one tendency or extreme of that mode of action, which is like the coincidence of oneself with oneself that's never totally complete. And then on the other sense, there's action that is a kind of, scattered about in a way. So that's where I think that's basically the best way I can kind of fully articulate where action plays into that kind of goes along with what Nit was just saying about this way of differentiating things between carving them up according to like this natural articulation, which that's kind of what he's saying that intuition is, in the sense of it's carving things up according to their real differences that are qualitative rather than quantitative. So, yeah.
He talks a lot about this, or it seems a fair amount. Maybe it's just that it caught my attention, these qualitative versus quantitative differences. And that Chase is talking about, and I don't have a clear sense of what he means by qualitative. I mean, quantitative, I think I understand. I'm guessing there he's talking about like when the intellect carves things up into little chunks, and you've got lots of little pieces that are interrelated to one another. But I don't know, maybe it's my intellect trying to understand an intuitive word, but I'm not sure what he means by qualitative differences.
So I think one way of kind of seeing it is that, so if you have, say, I would say even just like, okay, think of qualities or even, qualia in a sense of, theory of mind and whatnot, that if you have certain qualia, different qualia, that there's a difference in type there. Um, and he's not saying that that means that there's no difference uh, quantitatively, because he does say that there's always some kind of uh, extensive property that goes along with any kind of qualitative or intensive property. So that's one way to kind of see a qualitative difference, is that it's a difference in kind or type rather than degree. So degrees have, they're more arbitrary, and you can basically have any kind of articulation of them. It doesn't really matter. One is just the same as any other, magnitude and quantity. Or qualitative, there's real differences, almost kind of like there's like leaps in a way between things. That's a spatial way of putting it, but it's also connected with the idea of intensities, which is connected with it, where an intensity, in contrast to something that's extensive. So you can make the one way of seeing is so temperature is a intensive property, where heat is an extensive property. So if you have a rock and the molecules in the rock are moving at a certain speed, which is also an intensive property. But anyways, if you cut the rock in half, the heat is going to be cut in half too, because it's basically about degrees. But ultimately, the temperature though would stay the same even if you cut the rock in half, because it's not something that can be extended. It's something that's kind of dispersed through the whole thing. And then even then, of course, we have degrees that we can measure temperature, but 90 degrees Fahrenheit for one thing is never going to be exactly equal to 90 degrees Fahrenheit for something else. If you go far enough in, you'll basically see that there's differences there, and those would be intensive differences. So it's kind of hard to articulate, because these intensive properties are always connected with extensive properties, but those intensive differences, those qualitative differences, are really key for exactly what Bergson is trying to talk about. And at least according to Deleuze, that's basically what intuition is as a method of philosophy. It's basically being able to see qualitative differences, where the problems and the false problems of philosophy arise from only seeing things as quantitative differences. So I really, so I know Deleuze is, his like difference repetition is, incredibly difficult to read, but this book, Bergsonism, I find really simple, I guess, and is, at least for Deleuze, and it really helped clarify a lot of stuff for me. And I've only read basically like the first chapter and a half or so. And actually, I have a PDF of it that I can link in the comments here. Am I frozen, or is it there's just a lapse of silence? Okay.
Nobody knows what to say.
Yeah,
I've stunned all of you with my amazing analysis, right?
I don't know what to say either, but I guess I'll say something, because I'm thinking about like action, maybe not as like literal action, but as an idea of like recognizing things like while they're occurring, kind of similar to duration, I guess, in a sense. But like, because I'm reading now like all this stuff about induction and deduction and how they both kind of ideally lead to geometry, but the process of getting there in a way is like the action, like leading to that spatiality, which is kind of the end goal that we want to lead to and understand. The process of kind of going from, or the process of a movement basically over which induction and deduction like move. We constantly want to like reach the end of that, in the same way that we see like intelligence as a circle. We see it as kind of the end being the beginning, and kind of being this process that leads somewhere, or has an end. So rather than understanding action as literally being kind of like physically doing things, maybe it's just the understanding something while it's happening, in the same way of understanding duration while time is happening, rather than as a concept reflectively. It's like we constantly want to see the end and recognize what the ideal limit of something will be. We recognize the tangent of a line being the entirety of it. So I don't know. I mean, I still don't really have a conception of what that action actually means, and maybe that's because I'm trying to intellectualize it, but I still don't see it as like as physical action, but as just this idea of like the process of moving between two things, maybe, or just movement in general, as not being this physical movement of my body, but a movement between ideas. And if we're moving between these ideas in our head, maybe in that space between those ideas is where this thing that he's talking about is.
Yeah, I think movement is probably better than action in order to understand this. As he says in this, that basically movement is the real, is basically what he says. And so one example that he talks about in another essay, I think he says something, like Heraclitus, yeah. So I think he says something similar in this book, but I'll just give the example as I remember it in the other essay, which Intro to Metaphysics is it. So if I make a simple movement with my hand, I wave like this, I'm waving. For me, internally, that's a simple action that is a kind of continuous, undivided thing. But then if we look at it intellectually, which would be kind of in an external mode, and then we can basically use, say I have like a what is that, like motion capture suit, a motion capture glove getting my hand, waving. Then you can basically make different points according to the different movements. But what he's going to say is that no matter how detailed the points are, there's always going to be other points that can point towards a more detailed movement. That there's always some kind of movement that escapes the way that you would try to intellectually kind of put a grid between it. And so no matter what kind of the points that I'm making there, it's always going to be this abstract kind of mathematical placement on these things that effaces some of the actual movement there. But yet it's not altogether completely divorced from the real movement. It's just simply effacing some partial aspect of it. So I think one way to think of it is that there's kind of like this internal intuitive simplicity of the actual movement, and then there's this kind of uh, externalized spatial kind of mapping out, gridding, plotting of that same movement. And that's what the intellect kind of, in its essence, is doing. And what he wants to say is that that's not altogether completely an illusion. That's what the intellect is good at. It has a purpose for life, but ultimately, what he wants to do is kind of expand that and expand both of those at the same time. Because uh, what he says about intuition at the very beginning when he introduces it is that, you know, intuition in itself has basically the key to life, but the problem is that it's so enclosed in itself and limited that it can't go beyond that. But the intellect is capable of looking at things externally. It's capable of variety and going beyond all those things. And what he's saying basically is that if we kind of go back to like their common source in a way, that we can utilize both of those, and we can use the intellect's capacity to kind of like internally sympathize with the movement of life itself, but in a way kind of expand that through this this intellectual kind of at least the intellectual property of being able to kind of think outside of just oneself in a kind of immediate way. So that's what I see as kind of what's going on here. Hopefully that helped explain something.
This is kind of a non sequitur. If no one's gonna, if we're, no one's gonna respond to that. On page 206, this is just something I found interesting. The bottom of the top of the first partial paragraph. See, the intellect and matter have progressively adapted themselves one to the other in order to attain at last a common form. This adaptation has moreover been brought about quite naturally because it is the same inversion of the same movement which creates at once the intellectuality of mind and the materiality of things. So I'm not sure exactly how to unpack that, but he's contrasting that to on the previous page. You know, so I guess a kind of idealism where you would say, or well, let me just say what he says, you know, either mind conforms to matter or matter conforms to mind, or they have some mysterious, miraculous coincidence between the two, correspondence. And he says, well, it's neither one of those three. And I assume, again, I mean, every time he talks about some sort of movement or developmental process, I assume he's referring to evolution, that in his view, the mind and matter sort of evolved simultaneously in a way that made them conformable to one another. So I find that fascinating. I'm having, and maybe this is something he'll explain more. I'm having a hard time sort of grasping the metaphysics of that, what exactly that means, but it seems like an interesting thesis. You know, it wasn't like there was a material world and then you got this really complex organism that generated a nervous system and that generated a brain, and now you have consciousness. But then neither was it that there was some psychic substance that somehow condensed materiality. And then it's also not Kant or Descartes, but it's this other thing where the two emerge together through a process of evolution. Anyway, I don't know. I have a lot more to say. I don't have a real good sense of what that really means. But I thought it's a fascinating thesis, and is probably really crucial to his conception of evolution.
Yeah, I definitely think that is really important to basically explaining why the intellect really actually does know things, basically, but that it doesn't know everything. So he wants to he critiques the idea that, of course, that the intellect, whether through science or math or whatever Kantian stuff, that it can grasp everything, but he wants to say that it definitely does grasp something. And the way he kind of explains that is by explaining this kind of, they have the same origin, the same genesis, and that because matter and intellect have basically been formed out of the same kind of movement towards spatial tendency of, say, duration itself, or whatever you'd call it, like consciousness, I guess, kind of itself, towards its own kind of, I guess, like extension in a way. That's where it's difficult to explain exactly how those things would happen, except so he uses one way he talks about it is the whole, contraction versus the relaxation or detention kind of. But the way that he's kind of talking about how so I think one way, I guess, to clear it up is he says basically that the intellect has formulated because it's trying to like map out matter, essentially, because that's its function ultimately, is to like plot out the lines of movement and prediction and whatnot in matter. And that's why they match each other so well. That's why math works. That's why these things work so well. And there is this kind of, I guess, correspondence between those things. And so I think that's really key for him to, because he's trying to he's ultimately in this book, he's trying to show a connection between this kind of philosophy of life and a epistemology, a philosophy of knowledge. And he's trying to respond to people like Kant who are saying the same thing. All right, Austin, have fun meditating. So I think, this is really key to his overall project for talking about this. But then also, I think the other facet that is connected with that's also important is that he's saying that, yes, this is why math works in part, but he also has this whole thing about why it only works in part, why there's something that always kind of exceeds that. And that's another aspect that kind of goes into the same things, I guess. I'll just leave that there and see if anyone else has some.
Sorry if this has been kind of the Chase and Nevitt show. Yes, Sean and Travis have,
Hunter, say something.
I try to blather as much as I feel won't get horribly annoying.
See, I don't have that filter, so I'm just knowing.
One thing that I did want to mention, this is definitely a tangent off of literally but like kind of offhandedly, Chase was sort of mentioning, some of the ways that we frame why we like, or why we would be interested in a project like Bergson, or a lot of these projects that are sort of critical of like traditional rationality and traditional modes of reason and stuff like that, is like this sense that they kind of don't fully account for the information that they're trying to account for, right? Like, I do this kind of reductive quantitative analysis of something, and I sort of just find that it doesn't quite answer everything, and so I go searching for like a further explanation. And I was thinking about that with respect to some other things that Bergson is sort of saying. I don't know if I have like a precise point here, but basically, is that the correct way to approach things? I certainly, like, Bergson seems to think that like an intellectual approach will at least always provide answers, right? Like a scientific reductive analysis of things will always give us answers to all of the questions that we're looking for. And if that's true, then, like, in a kind of philosophy of science discussion, why like why are we searching for this other explanation at all? I mean, Bergson seems to think that, like, we should do it basically because his analysis seems to demonstrate that there's something beyond, like, the intellectuality. But I guess the question that I have is, like, if it's true that an intellectual analysis will always eventually arrive at, like, some sort of explanation of what's going on, then what is interesting about the possibility of finding whatever this deeper, more comprehensive method that I would assume sort of transcends both instinct and intelligence? Like, why is it interesting? That's a thought that I was having.
So one thought I have in response is that, the history of science is not the history of figuring out what reality is. It's the history of lots of revisions to what we think reality is. And so it's not like this process has given us the one true metaphysics. And so, as he points out, when you rely exclusively on analysis, you always lose something. And the divisibility of matter is maybe a case in point that we have this mathematical notion that things have to be infinitely divisible, and yet when you start trying to do that to matter, you start getting atoms, and then subatomic particles, and then quarks, and then fields. And so maybe even something like a field is beginning to approach closer to what he's thinking of as what reality is like, as a continuous medium with lumps in it, or something like that. And what I wonder is if he, I don't really know what he would say, but I wonder if he would say if maybe some of the great minds in science have actually been doing something similar to what he's suggesting. So, you've probably heard the stories, like when one of the inspirations for Einstein's general theory of relativity is he asked himself, what would the world like, or what would that clock look like if I was riding on a light beam? And that's not a terribly mathematically precise analytical way of beginning a scientific investigation. Or he asked himself, what does simultaneous mean? I see these two lightning strikes. I see them simultaneously, but I know that they're not really right next to each other. So what does that mean? And then Maxwell, who came up with electromagnetic theory, when he was developing his theory, he came up with all these fanciful pictures and models in his mind of chains pulling through systems of gears. And this illustration, I don't know that he came up with it. It may have been Lorenz or somebody, but the bell tower analogy, where if you're standing in the bottom of a bell tower and you've got these two ropes that or say one rope that's going up through the ceiling, all you can see is a ceiling with a hole in it. But when you pull on the rope, it makes a certain sound. And you could characterize pretty precisely and mathematically the forces on that rope, like how much you have to pull it and how much it recoils and how that rope oscillates back and forth. But none of that is telling you what's going on inside the bell tower. And so you have to construct these imaginative models of what's going on inside the bell tower to explain the phenomena that we have you could say, scientific access to. So when you read some of the history of some of these scientists, I wonder, I don't know, but I'm wondering if maybe he's saying that these sort of radical, groundbreaking scientific theories, at least some of them, may have been when scientists were making use of some of this intuition, perhaps. And so maybe making use of intuition gets us a little bit closer to the real.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. You know, essentially, why should we care about this? What does this really tell us? And I definitely agree that I think so. He says that that ultimately, you know, this kind of fluid movement of the real is exactly that. It's really, that's what is real. And it's real, but it's also this source of creativity and creativity in terms of, you know, just morphogenesis, the formation of things, but also intellectual creativity. So I think he says somewhere in the reading that, you know, if you just think in terms of this, like this, the givenness of the intellect, it's kind of something that is self-enclosed in itself, and it can only lead to these circles. So basically, the intellect, you know, thinking of, or science or whatnot, basically, if you keep thinking in terms of these given, you can only basically get more approximate forms using the same kind of terms, the same kind of quantifications. But, you know, how would we actually get better in a much more profound way at being able to kind of approximate those things for science? I think you would have to get ultimately a kind of sense of that movement that isn't captured exactly in any of those given kind of quantifications, reifications, segmentations of the intellect. And in order to kind of go back to the original movement, that there's a kind of creative genesis there that is a creative genesis in reality as this kind of absolute, you know, movement, but also in terms of the intellect's sympathy to be able to, that's really the source of conceptualizing these things in a newer, better way. So he talks about, you know, if we are just reduced to the intellect and whatnot, you know, what's the problem with that? So on 164, kind of in the middle there, he talks about this idea, I think he's talking about causality and whatnot. So he says basically, the causality it seeks and finds everywhere, I guess the intellect, expresses the very mechanism of our industry, in which we go on recomposing the same whole with the same parts, repeating the same movements to obtain the same results. The finality it understands best is the finality of our industry, in which we work on a model given in advance, that is to say, old or composed of elements already known. As to invention, properly so called, which is, however, the point of departure of industry itself, our intellect does not succeed in grasping it in its upspringing, that is to say, in its indivisibility, nor in its fervor, that is to say, in its creativeness. Explaining it always consists in resolving it. It is the unforeseeable and new into elements old or known, arranged in a different order. The intellect can no more admit complete novelty than real becoming. That is to say, here again, it lets an essential aspect of life escape as if it were not intended to think such an object. So there, I think he's explaining basically how it has problems grasping actual creativity and whatnot. And it, in a sense, it kind of dooms things to just repetitions of the same movements and whatnot. I think there's definitely, to go back to Sean's question, basically, why should we care about this? I think there's huge social implications here that we can think about in the sense of, I think a lot of people, especially now, they realize there's problems with basically the elements that we're thinking of in terms of society in general as a whole right now, that we're thinking in these articulations that there's something kind of artificial and wrong with them. The way that we divide all these things up in society, the way that we think of these things only in terms of, basically, I think of like this very practical action that's kind of very limited towards like a self-interest also. And, how do we go back and really think in different ways as a society? I think we have to go back and, kind of transcend these categories that we've kind of pretty much invented to make some distinctions over others. But really, if we kind of connect with that indivisibility, the movement where these categories kind of disintegrate and there's really these forms that are interpenetrating each other, if we can go and see that kind of commonality, I guess, that we all are a part of as humans, as life in general, then I think we could possibly get some kind of creativity to think better. They'll have implications in a social dimension, in an ecological dimension, because, I think this is one way to think in a less anthropocentric manner, to think in a lot of ways that, I think the intellect, basically, this kind of pure intellect that just thinks in terms of the same thing, it's kind of limited to these already pre-given units. And I think what we need to do is kind of rethink the actual movement. And then when we conceptualize that movement, we need better conceptualizations that more match that kind of fluidity of the movement. And I think if we can do that, I think a lot of times that's kind of ultimately what we're trying to do in terms of critical theory and things like that, is we're trying to like put these categories in motion rather than as these absolute determinants of one way or the other. So I like to think if philosophy and just theory in general can have any kind of a real impact on anything, it's basically this kind of way of conceptualizing new concepts, of creating new concepts that inject something new and creative in our thinking and then therefore in our action. So that's kind of, I guess that's the way I would answer that. Hopefully that's actually works in some way.
Well, it's 4:00.
Those were enjoyable answers. So.
Everyone looks exhausted.
Nobody liked my impassioned plea for novelty and creativity.
I thought it was, Hunter just flipped us off. I thought it was very beautiful and reminded me of Deleuze, whom I know very little about. So, but no, that's sounds right. So any last,
did Hunter get cut off, by the way, earlier? Like, I feel like I might have accidentally cut him off with my question, because I saw his like picture flash up on the screen, and I didn't think about that till just now.
Sorry, did you refer to me? You cut out when you said the proper name.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, there have been a couple misfires this sit down where I've been like, oh, I can maybe muster something up, and then I was like, somebody else is much more in tune with their inner thinker. and I am not. And in fact, actually, Chase, after you talked, Chase, I just wanted to be like, the first thing and only thing I would say the entire time would just be, I agree.
You got to realize that Hunter reads a lot of Zizek, so you know that's what happens to your. This is like your brain on Zizek.
Yeah, I start to decompose. I start to enact my death drive.
Exactly. That's the Oedipal. You're being inserted into the Oedipal triangulation of castration anxiety or whatever.
Yeah, I can't stop thinking about my mom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not
that
good.
works. Yeah.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, we'll see you next
Oh
week.
yeah. One thing. In the chat, I put the link towards the Bergsonism thing. I think that this book, at least it helps me conceive of it somewhat, even if I can't explain it very well. So I think you should be able to download it from there. So yeah.
I'll leave the Zoom thing up for a minute or two if people want to select that link. So.
Oh yeah, I guess we could talk somewhat about the next semester or seminar. So I was gonna post basically my my case for why Schelling I think would be interesting. So to hope to get some kind of a dialogue, especially if there are people that want to do something different. So
Yeah, for my part, I'm happy to read anything that falls within the range of deeper interest that I have, and pretty much anything that includes pretty much anything in German idealism, existentialism, phenomenology, and its associated thinkers and descendants. So so I'm okay with that. But as Chase said, and I don't know, maybe you said you've talked to Travis and Hunter, but Sean or Madeline or anyone, if you do have other preference or reason not to read Schelling, feel free to say something, or if you want to support that choice, feel free to say something on that message thread. A couple of people who are not here in this meeting sent me private messages, which is fine, but I was thinking of it as being more of a public dialogue among people in this group. And those two people, by the way, one of them said they're probably not going to be able to participate in much, and the other one said they didn't really care what we read. So anyway, feel free to respond to that link.
I will express this in an email as well, but I will say I'm very excited to do Schelling. I've heard really good things about him. Both Declan and Stefan have been trying to get me to read Schelling for a while, so I definitely am very excited about that possibility. I'll send out an email to that effect as well, and also include stuff about what times I'm available and stuff like that.
One of my main reasons for, besides just general interest in German idealism, as I said in my, when I sent that message out, is, I mean, I don't claim to know a great deal about any of these guys. I mean, I'll be quite honest, the first time I ever read Fichte was when I taught 19th century philosophy, which I've done a few times now, so I've read that stuff more than once. And I'm also I have only a cursory experience with Hegel, but at least I've read Fichte and Hegel some. I haven't read any Schelling, and he is one of the big guys. You know, it's like Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel is the big German idealistic arc there. So that's one reason why it would, be of particular interest to me. It's just a huge gap in my background in an area I'm interested in. And he's not, I mean, as everybody here probably knows, he's not a secondary philosopher. He's considered a crucial part of that group there. So
What's like his frenemy / former roommate, right?
yeah, he was roommates with Hegel, and somebody maybe I'm thinking of Hegel, but they were roommates with someone else. I can't remember. It was I think like one of the famous
Holderlin
one
or
of the
Novalis?
poets or something, or like, oh, what's that? Was it Holderlin or
Holderlin.
I think maybe
Holderlin
Hegel
and
was.
Novalis and those romantic poets were.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But so I think Schelling is interesting. Is it's definitely a kind of gap in my own knowledge. It's connected with a lot of things I want to learn more about, and but it's also at the same time something different, not only for his actual thought, which I've only kind of read descriptions of or allusions to basically, but I've never actually read Schelling himself.
Me neither.
So I think that's why I think German idealism is a very important, precursor to a lot of this stuff that we're talking about, like Bergson and Merleau-Ponty and whatnot. But yet at the same time, it's something different that connects with, Hegel and Kant more so. So that's why I think it's kind of, it'd be something worthwhile. It's something a little different, but yet still connected enough. And then the material itself also seems different. It's much more kind of theological, where he's talking about basically like God and freedom and evil and stuff in the absolute or something like that. So I think that'll be another interesting thing to kind of talk about, rather than I'm basically a lot of stuff is kind of like this process relational philosophy, and I think Schelling is kind of like a precursor to that, but I think at the same time it is something kind of different that is a little goes back to other stuff that kind of goes beyond just this mode that I'm particularly really interested in, that we just have happened to do like the last 3 books or something. So
And Chase has done some research on the texts, and so if we end up going with Schelling and with those 2 books, he's done some research on editions and so on, so he can give us that information. Chase is back.
I'm back. Actually, my internet kind of held up pretty well today. I'm proud of my little computer.
Okay, well, we'll see you guys next time.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye bye.